Hi Nicola, can you tell me how you first came to meta-ethnography?
Well, funnily enough, I got into meta-ethnography through doing a systematic review of trials. So that might sound a strange way of coming into meta-ethnography. I was in a group that were looking at barriers to the use of asthma action plans, and these are recommended internationally and have been for decades, but there's lots of evidence to show they're not issued by professionals and they're not used by patients and by parents. So we started off doing a systematic review of trials to look at the barriers, and we found although there was a lot of quantitative evidence, it didn't really tell us much about how to get more of these actually owned and used in the future. But we found a lot of qualitative single standalone studies that told a lot about barriers and facilitators to the use of these plans from the perspective of patients and parents and health professionals. And after we did the trial systematic review, we thought it would be a good idea to do a meta-ethnography. And because I was new to that area at that time, we collaborated with other people, including Ruth Jepson, who had done meta-ethnography before. And we then did a synthesis of the qualitative evidence. And that's when I became a real fan of the approach, because that work gave us novel insight and original ideas and thinking into why asthma action plans weren't working. So I think it's got really huge potential because there's so much qualitative research that's been done already, and particularly in the fields of nursing, midwifery, the allied health professions. So Ruth Jepson and I went on to do a lot more work, and then we collaborated with Emma France on what's now the eMERGe project.
So can you tell me a bit about what it is?
The project was ultimately about producing reporting guidance, because we know that qualitative evidence synthesis is being increasingly used, and there are many approaches, but meta-ethnography is the leading approach. It's the one that's used most often. But we know from previous work that many of them are poorly reported, and that you can't have confidence really in how they were conducted, and you can't often tell if they actually were meta-ethnographies. So the quality of the reporting is very, very variable. So the reporting guidance is to enable potential end users of the reporting guidance to help them report meta-ethnography findings in a way that's more transparent, and therefore hopefully increase the likelihood of meta-ethnography findings being incorporated into future health policy and practice.
Okay, so who would use the guidance then?
Well, we would see that there's three groups of people that would use the guidance. There would be those who are conducting meta-ethnographies or supervising junior researchers doing meta-ethnographies. They'll be a key group.
So academics.
Academics, but it's not just them. Because meta-ethnography's got huge potential to inform policy and practice, guideline development, health technology assessment, a lot of people developing that kind of evidence for practice could use the reporting guidance, because it would help them understand what's considered to be quality reporting, and it would help them understand the findings and to understand whether the findings are potentially relevant in the context of the work that they're trying to do. So people generating evidence for practice and guidelines are another potential key group of users. But there's also a third group, and that's clearly journal editors and journal reviewers. Many meta-ethnographies are being published. They're of varying quality, and certainly there's many people acting perhaps as reviewers who are experienced in qualitative research or experienced in quantitative research and quantitative systematic reviewing, but are perhaps unfamiliar with particularly meta-ethnography, and so it will be useful for journal editors and reviewers to help them understand the quality of the reporting that's been submitted for publication.
So this is the guidance here, and I notice that this follows the 7 phases of meta-ethnography.
It does, and that's really important. There are other reporting guidelines, and they often focus on the format maybe of journal headings or the sort of research process. And initially we thought we would do that too, but actually as we went through the 2-year development process, we realised that because these are methodologically specific, that we had to reflect the 7 stages of meta-ethnography, that was the best way to enable them to be used. Having said that, we've also tried to make a connection between the reporting criteria and the different journal section headings. So for example, in phase 4, there are reporting criteria that we think could sit within the methods section of a journal and the findings section. So yes, they're structured primarily around the 7 phases of meta-ethnography, but they are also acknowledging where they might sit within a journal paper. The other thing I should say about the reporting criteria is that they're not mandatory. We're not saying this is what people should do or have to do or must do, but they are evidence-based.
So it's not like a tick box exercise?
No, but they are evidence-based, so therefore we would advise or recommend their use. And because it's not a checklist, and because the format of journals vary, or the context in which people are reporting their meta-ethnographies will vary, then we also understand that it might be when somebody's using this, they might report a particular item maybe in a different phase from where we've indicated it here. So there is some flexibility, but it's just to show people where we think a particular reporting criterion best fits in terms of the 7 phases.
So you encourage reporting of all of the 7 phases?
We know from the eMERGe project and earlier work that Emma and I and others have done that phases 1 to 4 reporting is reasonably well done, but there are some areas where it could be improved. So for example, in phase 1, introduction, we are now saying it would be helpful or advisable if people reporting meta-ethnography wrote in the report a bit about the qualitative literature that was available at the beginning for them to synthesise. Okay. And also if they provide their rationale for why meta-ethnography. And that's because there are many different approaches to qualitative evidence synthesis, and it's helpful if people reporting meta-ethnographies say why they chose that particular method, and then it enables readers to understand then whether their aims and the review questions are then congruent with that particular approach.
Why would you recommend meta-ethnography above other quality evidence synthesis approaches?
Well, it does depend on what you're doing and the context. For me, I think the advantage is that it allows you to produce this new overarching interpretation, this new conceptual framework, theory or model, and that's where I think it stands differently from other approaches. But it is an advanced qualitative approach as well. And I like how it's got the 7 phases. I think it works well, particularly when many people coming into meta-ethnography have maybe experience in doing systematic reviews of trials, and they're used to doing the early phases like finding the literature and reporting on their screening outcomes. But you mentioned earlier about, do you think it's important that they report on the 7 phases? We know, again, from the eMERGe project and other work, that reporting in phases 5 to 6 is probably the poorest. And yet these are the phases that are quintessentially meta-ethnography. At the moment, people are very good at reporting their reciprocal translations, but they are less likely to report refutational translations and disconfirming cases. So there's a reporting criteria about that. But also, phase 7, expressing the synthesis, we have a reporting criterion about reflexivity. And that's because, again, from the work we've done, we know that people writing meta-ethnography reports are really good at reflecting on the limitations of their original studies. So, for example, saying these studies were all of white women conducted in the UK. But in the meta-ethnography reports, they're not very good at then reflecting on how they conducted their meta-ethnography and how that influenced their interpretation. And they're also not then very good at reflecting on how their perspectives could have influenced their interpretation and how alternative explanations might be possible. So in the reporting criteria, we're asking them to now consider whether the gender or the cultural mix of the research team, their epistemological perspective, their academic discipline, that's all going to contribute to their final overarching interpretation. And it's important that they reflect on that and how perhaps if it was a different team with different perspectives or from different countries and cultures,
they might have a different interpretation.
Exactly. So yes, we would say it's important that people report according to 7 phases.
And what you're saying about reflexivity there really is interesting, in that this is unique, the findings, to the individual or the team that's done the meta-ethnography, and that it might not necessarily be repeatable. Is that right?
Yes and no, I would say. Okay. In terms of certainly the early phases, that what's really important is that you want to understand how they found their included studies, their search terms, their search strategy, their inclusion and exclusion criteria, and certainly we're wanting that information reported. In terms of whether it's repeatable, it's more to do with the interpretation and how it's been arisen. And so clearly, you know, if you and I were doing an interpretation or doing a meta-ethnography, the final interpretation is going to reflect our perspectives. and our gender, our cultural context, our professional disciplines. And so you could have perhaps another team that are doing the very same thing with the very same set of included papers who could come up with a different interpretation. But meta-ethnography is still an evolving field, and the eMERGe project has identified a lot of issues that are actually perhaps issues for what happens after the project. So I think that more methodological work is required, but also longer term, once the reporting guidance has been in use, then we do want to evaluate it, and it's perhaps likely that the reporting guidance is going to need to be revised or tweaked to make it more appropriate for users in the longer term.
So what started off as a systematic review has become
yes,
a lifelong career in meta-ethnography.
Well, what started off as a one-off short-term project has taken off in a way that we hadn't foreseen, but I think it's partly because I can see the huge potential for meta-ethnography to contribute to the generation of evidence for policy and practice. And for me, it's really important that we do capture the views of patients and carers and parents, and meta-ethnography is one way of doing this. So for me, I think it's certainly really important that we continue to develop meta-ethnography as a means of generating evidence for practice and to support decision-making and practice.
Okay, so any advice then for a novice meta-ethnographer, Nicola?
Just get started and use our eMERGe reporting guidance.
Okay, thanks, Nicola.